over the island of Oahu turned pitch black. 6 aircraft carriers, 15 warships, and about 350 aircraft began a swift attack on Pearl Harbor. With relentless bombings, the US Navy base, Army base, and Marine Corps base were all thrown into chaos. The Japanese Imperial forces had unleashed this hell. In just about 2 hours of Japan's surprise attack, the calm and peaceful island of Oahu in Hawaii was turned into an ashen hell in an instant. Why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? Let's now dive into the attack on Pearl Harbor, the event that marked the beginning of a war that completely changed the course of 20th century world history. Hello, this is Gino, the man who reads the history of every war in the world. As all of Europe was engulfed in the suffering of World War II, attention to regions outside Europe gradually faded, and that's when another power began its expansion across East Asia and the Pacific region, igniting another conflict. It was Japan, which launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and started the Pacific War. To carry out this attack, the Japanese military secretly moved 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 15 warships, and about 350 aircraft to a point 320 kilometers north of Oahu Island. The scale of this fleet exceeded the strength of the US Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor. At the time, the United States had only 4 aircraft carriers, and in terms of speed and in several aspects of battleship combat power, Japan's warships actually outclassed those of the US Navy. The Japanese fleet and carrier-based aircraft, having arrived at the attack point, quickly began their assault on Pearl Harbor. They first focused on destroying the Pacific Fleet and aircraft stationed at Pearl Harbor. Their initial bombing target was Wheeler Field, the largest airbase on Oahu Island. Due to relentless bombing, the American fighter planes stationed there were destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. And that wasn't all. Within just a few minutes of the bombing, the US Navy, Army, and Marine Corps bases on Oahu were all rendered inoperative. Not a single Navy fighter aircraft managed to take off. Only about 30 Army Air Corps fighters were barely able to scramble. Still, the fact that such a complex and widespread attack was executed so precisely was almost unprecedented in aerial operations at the time. Just as they had planned, the Japanese forces destroyed all designated targets and completely eliminated the US military's air superiority. At that time, the Japanese military devised an extremely sophisticated operation. The US fleet was arranged in 2 rows. The ships on the inside were destroyed by bombs dropped from planes flying horizontally overhead. The ships on the outer row were attacked with torpedoes. This was because the inner ships could not be targeted with torpedoes. However, this kind of torpedo attack was not easy. To successfully carry out the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan brought out a secret weapon. They developed a new type of torpedo. One of the difficulties in launching a torpedo attack at Pearl Harbor was that the torpedoes needed to be deployed effectively. They needed to travel a certain distance through the water before striking their targets. But to prevent this, nets were installed, and moreover, the water at Pearl Harbor was shallow. As a result, torpedoes would often hit the seafloor and explode before reaching the target. To solve these various problems, the torpedoes were modified to be dropped from a short distance, fall quickly, not dive too deep, and immediately rise and travel toward the ship. To achieve this, the torpedoes had to be extensively improved, and the aircraft had to carry out highly dangerous low-altitude bombing. But the Japanese overcame all this through training. Japanese high-altitude bombers dropped 5 bombs on the USS Arizona. One of the bombs happened to ignite the most dangerous explosive on board, about 7,000 tons of black powder. As a result, the ship exploded like a volcano. Of the more than 1,100 crew members aboard the Arizona, not a single one survived. The US military, unable to believe that a war had actually begun due to the sudden Japanese attack, failed to mount an effective response. At this point, the Japanese launched a second wave of attacks. This time, they approached from the opposite direction compared to the first wave. Some forces headed for the airfield at Kaneohe, while others returned to Pearl Harbor to launch additional attacks on the remaining ships of the Pacific Fleet. After a total of just 1 hour and 50 minutes, the attack concluded. By the end of that day, 3 battleships of the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor had been sunk, and 18 other vessels, including another battleship, had been damaged. The skies above Pearl Harbor were filled with thick black smoke, and the ground below had turned into utter chaos. On that day, due to the Japanese surprise attack, approximately 2,300 US military personnel, including Hawaiian residents, were killed, and around 1,380 were injured. The once proud naval base, air base, and airfields of Pearl Harbor were struck, resulting in the destruction of about 188 aircraft. In contrast, Japanese losses were limited to 29 aircraft and damage to around 6 midget and large submarines. Prior to the attack, Japan had sent numerous spies to Hawaii to gather information on military facilities and equipment. Some reports suggest there were as many as 200 spies. The key reason this espionage operation succeeded was that many Japanese people had previously immigrated to Hawaii to work on plantations. Just like how the first generation of Korean immigrants moved to Hawaii, a large number of Japanese had also settled there, to the point where many Hawaiians today have Japanese ancestry. Japanese people played a significant role in Hawaii's development and still make up a considerable portion of its population. Because of this existing Japanese community, it was easier for spies to operate undetected. In May 1940, a man named Yoshikawa, dispatched by the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff, began living under the alias Morimura and served as the first secretary at the Japanese consulate in Honolulu. From there, he gathered intelligence on the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor. All he seemed to do was visit a beachside bar run by Japanese immigrants, sit on the railing and enjoy the ocean view, or stroll along the beach. He would take a taxi toward Pearl Harbor, look out the window, or stop by a factory where naval vessels were being repaired and have a soft drink. In reality, however, he was carefully observing U.S. Navy ships, entering restricted U.S. military zones, and carrying out his assigned missions under a thorough plan. He also monitored U.S. military movements from within the consulate. One of his top priorities was to regularly check the local Hawaiian newspapers. At the time, these newspapers reported on the size and activities of the U.S. fleet stationed in Hawaii, including arrival and departure dates. He would relay all of this information directly to Japan. Among the consulate staff was also a reconnaissance agent who had undergone 4 years of intensive education and training focused on the U.S. military in the Pacific region. This agent would climb hills near Pearl Harbor with a telescope to observe the harbor and airfields, moving between different observation points to closely monitor the port. Some Japanese merchants who had been bribed by Japan, along with German-American spies, also reported information back to Japan. What kind of intelligence did the spies operating in Hawaii gather through these activities? They discovered not only the basic defensive structures of the US Navy, the types and numbers of aircraft and warships, their docking locations and days off, but also that the battleships at the pier were docked in 2 rows, that the greatest number of vessels were in the harbor on Sundays, and that in May 1941, 1/4 of the fleet's strength had moved to the Atlantic. From this, Japan understood that a Sunday attack would allow them to destroy the greatest number of US naval vessels. Japan then began full-scale military planning and preparations for war. The Japanese military used maps of Pearl Harbor and Oahu Island to identify key geographical features in advance. They also built a scale model and carried out simulations to determine how to conduct the air raid. Furthermore, they conducted practical and tactical training, including critical low-altitude flying and bomb-dropping exercises on Sakurajima Island in Kyushu, which closely resembled Pearl Harbor. 2 individuals played particularly decisive roles in the success of the Pearl Harbor attack: Hideki Tojo and Isoroku Yamamoto. 2 months before the attack, Hideki Tojo, then Minister of the Army, had risen to the position of Prime Minister. He had long been a strong advocate for war with the United States. Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, argued that in order to win a war against the United States, Japan needed to swiftly strike at America's vital point, the Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto was considered the foremost expert on the United States within the Japanese military at the time. He had studied in the US and made several key predictions in preparation for a possible war with America. 1. If the war between Britain and Germany became prolonged and the United States intervened, Germany would be defeated. 2. If Japan joined the Tripartite Pact, it would end up fighting the United States alone. 3. Japan would ultimately lose a war against the United States. then why would someone as intelligent as Yamamoto, who had predicted that Japan would inevitably lose the war, proceed with a war against the United States? In fact, this is somewhat misunderstood. According to The Art of War by Sun Tzu, before going to war, one must thoroughly analyze both the enemy's strength and one's own to determine whether victory is possible. However, many people tend to misinterpret this. They think that if an analysis shows the enemy's strength is 100 and ours is 70, then we will lose, so we should give up. But that's not what Sun Tzu meant. Instead, the idea is to ask, what strategy can I use to turn the situation around? That's where a decision must be made, whether to challenge or to retreat. Yamamoto's 3 predictions were not statements of surrender, but objective assessments of the situation. That is why Yamamoto believed that even if there was only a 1% chance of victory, war was still worth pursuing. He felt it was a soldier's duty to obey orders and to find that chance. For Yamamoto, the only way to defeat the United States was through a surprise attack, a perfect and thoroughly planned surprise attack. This belief is what led to the preparation for the attack on Pearl Harbor. After thorough preparations, and under the orders of Hideki Tojo, Yamamoto issued Naval Order No. 1 in mid-November 1941, officially initiating combat operations. This order commanded the fleet to secretly assemble and wait at Iturup Island in the Kuril Islands by November 20th. The distance from there to Pearl Harbor was over 6,500 kilometers, an immense journey that took approximately 12 days. Under Yamamoto's full command, 6 aircraft carriers loaded with planes began moving in utmost secrecy. What made this so remarkable was the fact that such a massive fleet managed to sail across the Pacific for over 12 days without being detected by any other nation. No matter how vast the Pacific Ocean may be, the routes to travel are limited. Therefore, the greatest challenge of the Pearl Harbor operation was navigating this enormous fleet across the Pacific without detection. To figure out how to accomplish this, Japan spent over 10 years studying the routes of all ships that had crossed the Pacific. They discovered that during the winter, ships rarely traveled above the 40th parallel north. So, they decided to exploit this and moved their fleet through the northern route. To ensure the secrecy of this movement, they implemented several additional measures. All communications were completely cut off, and they left no trace, not even by throwing garbage into the sea. With this level of organization, discipline in following orders, and unity, they were able to cross the Pacific undetected. As a result, Japanese carrier-based aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor before the US military could even react. Immediately after Japan dropped the first bomb on Pearl Harbor, the US command transmitted a radio message to all naval forces at sea. Some, feeling the intense vibrations that filled Pearl Harbor, thought it was just an earthquake. Others assumed it was a routine gunnery drill. Why was it that the US military, despite being the most powerful force, was unable to properly defend against the Japanese attack? Although the attack could have been prevented, the US failed to catch the warning signs. One small oversight triggered a massive war. Now, let's take a closer look at the attack on Pearl Harbor.